All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to OETC and Microsoft's M365 webinar series. I'm James Kelly, OETC's marketing coordinator. Today's session will cover the basics on how to enroll and manage your Windows devices with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. We'll be looking at the different ways you can enroll existing as well as new devices, application deployment best practices, and policy deployment. This session will be presented by Richard Balsley, Principal Technical Specialist on Microsoft's education team. The session is also being recorded and will be sent out next week. There'll be time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to ask your questions throughout the webinar. On the next slide, I'll take a quick moment to highlight OETC's renewal team, some of whom are on today's webinar. If you have any licensing questions, you can reach out to help@oetc.org, and someone from the team will be happy to assist you. And with that, I'll hand it off to you, Richard.
All right, thanks a lot, James. So, hi, everyone. If you were here last time for the Windows 11 SE, Windows 11 webinar, then you probably remember who I am. But if you weren't, my name is Richard Balsley. I am a principal specialist here at Microsoft. As James mentioned, I'm focused primarily on the US education team, both K-12 and higher education. And today we are going to talk about Microsoft Endpoint Manager. But the big thing we're really going to focus on here is really enrollment of devices. That's, I think, the biggest stumbling block that people have originally getting into Endpoint Manager or getting into Intune. But first, we're going to talk about just a bit about what Endpoint Manager is. A lot of people get confused. They're like, Endpoint Manager? I thought you were talking about Intune. Well, Intune is a part of Endpoint Manager, so we'll talk about what Intune is and how that integrates with System Center Configuration Manager. We'll also go through how to enroll devices into Azure AD. As I mentioned before, that's usually one of the biggest confusion pieces that customers have is how do I get my devices in? I've got devices on the domain. I've got new devices. I've got SCCM. I've got some third-party tool. Like, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to get these things into Intune? And what's the best way to do it? Because there's so many different ways to do it. And then we'll wrap up by going through the console and looking at application deployment and policy management and some differences between what you're probably doing today with group policy and how that changes with something like Microsoft Intune and Endpoint Manager. So let's just start with a recap, high level. If you've never seen this before, you have no idea what Microsoft Endpoint Manager is. It's effectively Microsoft combining Microsoft Intune and System Center Configuration Manager into one product. So when you purchase, you guys are using, most likely you're probably licensed for Microsoft 365 A3 or A5 subscriptions. If you have those subscriptions, you have access to something called the Enterprise and Mobility Suite. That EMS suite is what contains licensing for Microsoft Intune. And Microsoft Intune licensing also includes System Center Configuration Manager. If you have EMS, you have Intune, you have Configuration Manager. If you have A3, you have Configuration Manager and Intune. And so a lot of you guys are probably already used to or have heard of Configuration Manager because it's the on-premises product that we've been using for deploying applications and settings and operating system deployment. And Intune has been our cloud or our mobile device management solution. And so we're combining both of these into one product, and that's where you see this unified admin console. That's where we're unifying both the management of Configuration Manager and of Microsoft Intune. And so with that, you get access to a number of different features and functionalities like Windows Autopilot. We'll talk a lot about Autopilot today from an enrollment perspective, but also how do we secure our devices, leveraging either Intune or Configuration Manager to provide our security policies for Microsoft Defender. And then also application management, deploying applications to devices, as well as endpoint analytics. Endpoint analytics, if you haven't seen this before, it's a pretty interesting tool that allows us to see a variety of different analytical things on our devices. Things like startup performance. How fast do our devices boot? Do we have any issues with devices crashing? If there's a driver that's causing problems with a machine that crashes, you typically don't know that until someone opens a help desk ticket. Well, with endpoint analytics, we can actually see that happening in roughly real time. When that crash happens, that that crash will actually get sent up into endpoint analytics, and you can see if you have a number of devices that are having these problems, or if it's a specific model, then you might know, oh, maybe I need to go and update that driver. Or maybe there's an application that's crashing, and oh, maybe I need to update that application. So endpoint analytics gives us a lot of visibility into things that prior we haven't had any visibility into without having our help desk or having our users call into the help desk and let us know about it. Now with Configuration Manager and Intune, you know, they operate, initially they operate as two standalone products. So you've got Configuration Manager on premises, and then you have Microsoft Intune that's in the cloud. Now you can operate both of these separate. You don't have to have, you know, both of these in order to use Endpoint Manager. If you're just trying to manage devices strictly in the cloud, you know, as things have changed over the last 2 years since the pandemic, most customers are trying to adopt a cloud-only model from a device management perspective. And so in that regard, you don't need Configuration Manager. But a lot of you guys probably have it today because it's been around for 20 plus years going back to SMS. And so if you have it today and you're looking at trying to move to the cloud, then you're probably looking at trying to move to Intune. That's why you're here today. And so let's just talk about what both of these look like when they're integrated together. So again, they're two separate products, and then we're calling them Microsoft Endpoint Manager. But what you can do with Configuration Manager today is you can do something called tenant attach. And tenant attach takes your on-premises environment, your on-premises Windows machines. You might have some Apple devices. You probably don't have any on-premises domain joined Apple devices or Linux devices being managed by SCCM today. We did have connectors for these a while back. Most people weren't actually leveraging those, but you're primarily doing Windows on-prem. And so you got your Windows on-premises devices with tenant attach. We can take those devices and put them over into that Intune console. And so now you'll see these devices show up in Intune, but they're not actually managed by Intune. They're just showing up there. There's this other component that we have called co-management. That's that number 2 you see in the center of the screen. Co-management is what allows us to take a device that is in Configuration Manager and also in Microsoft Intune. And you might think, well, that sounds really complicated. Why would I ever want to do something like that? Well, you'd want to do something like that because imagine a pandemic hits and you've got a bunch of devices that were being used by your teachers in the classroom or your students in the classroom, and now you got to give those devices out to them. They got to go home with those devices. Well, your SCCM environment did not scale out to the internet. So you couldn't push applications. You couldn't push updates to those machines. Those machines were now on their own island, and they couldn't be managed whatsoever. And so if you were using co-management with SCCM and you had turned on co-management to have those devices also managed by Intune, you could deploy applications to those machines. You could deploy settings to those machines because it was a cloud managed solution. So those devices weren't orphaned. They're not just sitting in an island somewhere. They're at people's homes, but now you can actually push things to them. So by doing co-management, you're getting the benefits of the cloud and the on-premises. And so when those devices come back on premises, you can continue to use SCCM if you want, or you can move these workloads over to Microsoft Intune. All of your application deployment can go to Intune. All of your Windows updates can go to Intune. Resource access, or Wi-Fi profiles, all those things. All of that stuff can be moved over to Intune. And so think of this as a transitory method of going from on-prem over to the cloud. Okay, now let's shift a bit here, because again, this webinar is primarily going to be about enrolling devices into Azure Active Directory and how we get there, because it's going to be confusing. And the reason it's confusing is because we've got devices that are on premises today, but we also have devices that we're buying brand new. And we've got devices that are new that are going home with people. We might have people that are remote half the week. I know, we're seeing that a lot of states now are reducing their COVID restrictions. So a lot of states now and a lot of schools are on premises, and we are doing this hybrid learning where we have some students that are at home. We have a lot of students that are in the classroom. And so you're going to have these states where you're going to have people that are managed in both places. And so we have to understand from an identity perspective, where our devices are joined. And so in the Microsoft world, we've got on-premises Active Directory. But then we also have this Azure Active Directory thing. And with Azure Active Directory, that you guys have probably been using this already to manage your identities for Office 365. You're synchronizing identities up to the cloud, and you're synchronizing them to Azure AD. But your devices may not be joined to Azure AD. Your devices are probably joined on premises to your domain. But you can join these devices to Azure Active Directory. And when they're joined to Azure AD, they can be managed by Microsoft Intune. And so in this kind of state, these devices are corporate-owned devices, and they are joined to Azure AD, but they can access on-premises resources. And that's one of the confusion pieces that we see a lot of customers have, is that if the device is Azure AD joined, I can't get access to on-premises resources, and that's not true. You actually can get access to your on-premises file shares. You can get access to printers. You can get access to things that you use today on premises, even if that device is Azure AD joined. We're going to talk about some situations of things that you can't get access to, but by and large, most of the stuff that the data that you're trying to access on premises, you still will be able to access, even if it's Azure AD joined. Now, this is something that's Windows 10 only, and the join does require user interaction. And what this means is when we're joining these devices, we're going to talk about things like Autopilot. We're going to talk about using something called a provisioning package or a Windows configuration designer to enroll those devices. But users can also go through the out-of-box experience and join the device. They can type in their work email or their school email address and their credentials to join that device into the tenant. And then these devices are managed by MDM. And if you're leveraging co-management, like I mentioned earlier, we can use co-management to bridge that gap between on-premises and the cloud if you're in that hybrid state before transitioning everything over to Azure AD. Now, with hybrid Azure AD joined, this is a situation where you have a device that is joined to the domain. And this is where you're starting from today. All of your devices are primarily joined to a domain today. And so you're going to start in this scenario where we're hybrid Azure AD joined. And so that device is on the domain today, but we can register that device to Azure Active Directory. And by doing that registration, you now have a device object that's in Azure AD. And that object can then also be enrolled into Intune, and now you can push out applications and settings directly to that device. And so in this state, we consider this a transitory state, where we don't want customers to be hybrid Azure AD joined all the time. We want these machines to eventually get over to Azure AD, but we know that there's some situations where you're not going to be able to do that right away. And so we'll talk more about those situations and the considerations about when you should be in hybrid Azure AD join and when you should just fully move everything over to Azure AD. And then lastly, Azure AD registered. Think of this scenario as your bring your own device scenario. So we have situations where students, teachers, parents, even IT, staff, people will be joining their personally owned devices to the organization. Now, you may not want this, but you probably have a ton of devices in your tenant today that are Azure AD registered. And those devices are personal devices that are in the tenant. And what's important about this is that there's this line that's been blurred with devices today where a lot of people are using the device that they purchased to access company resources. And you might not have really thought of that as a big problem, but from a data security perspective, it actually is a really big problem because we can't know if that device is secure. And this goes into something that we call zero trust. In terms of zero trust, we don't trust devices that are joining our environment or trying to access our data. We need to leverage tools like conditional access that comes with Microsoft 365 to understand, is this device secure? Does it have, from a Windows perspective, does it have the Windows firewall on? Is Windows Defender up to date? Is the device BitLocker encrypted? If it meets our security posture, then that device can access resources in the tenant. It can access Microsoft 365. It can access Exchange Online. It can get access to SharePoint, to Teams. But if it doesn't meet those requirements, then that device can't access those resources. And so when people join these personal devices into the environment, historically, we've never tried to control those things. People just take their iPhone out and they'll join their work email to the mail app in Outlook, and now they've got access to all their mail. But now with Azure Active Directory, conditional access, Microsoft 365, you can control access to those things to make sure that if someone is trying to access that data, they're doing it in a secure way on a secure device. Now, moving back to Azure AD and hybrid Azure AD join. When should we do either of these things? Well, with hybrid Azure AD join, you need to think about situations where I've got a device and I need to use that domain computer object to get access to some resource. And the number one resource that typically needs to get access is wireless. Most times customers will have a wireless infrastructure that's set up that leverages radius authentication with the domain computer object. And if that's how you're doing wireless today, there is no domain computer object when you Azure AD join a computer, because that device that's joined to Azure AD, it's not on premises, it's up in the cloud. And so if that device is up in the cloud, there's no way that we can authenticate back to the wireless if we need that domain computer object, because the domain computer object doesn't exist. So this is something that most people don't think about early on in their journey to Azure AD join. They just decide, hey, we're going to go Azure AD join, we're going to start doing all this work, we're going to leverage Intune, we're going to manage devices. And then later on down the path, they've come to find, oh, wireless. How do I get onto my wireless network if I'm using Radius with device authentication? And so if you are in that situation, our wireless partners like Aruba, ClearPass, Cisco, with ICE and Meraki and all the other various ones that are out there, they generally have alternatives for authentication. If you're using domain computer objects today, but you want to get moved over to the cloud, you'll want to talk to your wireless vendor to see about that. Now, if you're using username and password authentication, then, which a lot of customers are, then that's not going to fundamentally change anything. That should be fine from an Azure AD join perspective. It's really if you're using that domain computer object, you need to really understand if you are doing that, then you're probably going to have to use hybrid Azure AD join for a while until you change how you're doing authentication to wireless. That's something you might have to work with your wireless team on, or work with your wireless vendors to see what alternatives you have. Now, Azure AD join, this is the long-term recommendation by Microsoft. And customers that had adopted Azure AD join prior to the pandemic really didn't have too many problems when the pandemic hit from a device management perspective. And that's, by and large, because the devices were all managed over the internet through Microsoft Intune. And as I mentioned earlier, with Azure AD join, users can do all of the common things. Like if you've got map network drives, we can map network drives with Intune. I do it with a number of customers today. So you can map a network drive, get access to file shares. That stuff still works. Print, that stuff works as well. We can use Universal Print as a service. You get it with A3, you have it with A5. Universal Print will allow you to actually publish your on-prem printers up to the cloud, and then print to those printers if necessary. And the big benefit here is that the devices can be managed anywhere, right? I mean, we have devices that are sitting in student homes that sit, underneath a bed. These devices can still, we can push up updates to them. We can push up applications and settings, and all that stuff works. But the biggest challenge that we have getting to Azure AD join is the migration. How do we migrate on-premises domain devices that are domain joined today? How do we migrate those to Azure AD? And the not so popular answer to that is, well, we have to reimage those devices. And the reason we have to do that is because there isn't anything today that could change the domain joined state from on-prem domain joined to Azure AD join. There's no supported way of doing that today. So if you were to disjoin the device from the domain and then join it to Azure AD, you could manually do those processes, but the user is going to get a new user profile. And so that's going to change for them. And so what you could also see in that kind of state is you might have group policies that get tattooed and they get stuck on the device. When you disjoin from a domain, you might have policies that get stuck on that device. And then as you join to Azure AD, you could have some policy things that could come up as well. So we want to make sure that that if you want to do this in a clean way, the cleanest way to do it is to reimage those devices that were on the domain. And this is probably something, it's like a summer project or maybe even a winter break kind of project. Or as devices are aging out, then you can do that too. Okay, so let's talk about the existing scenario, right? Because that's where you're starting from. You're going to start with all your devices that are on the domain today. How do we get hybrid Azure AD join configured so we can upload the devices into Azure Active Directory? And then how do we get Intune set up so that the devices are managed? So the first thing we need to do is we need to go into hybrid Azure, or we need to go into Azure AD Connect. And so if you're not the person that manages Azure AD Connect in your environment, go talk to your identity and access management team, whoever manages your domain controllers, have them work through this with you. And I'll have links to the docs as well if you want to go deeper into what that looks like. But I got screenshots here that basically just show you exactly how to do it. So you'll go into Azure AD Connect, select configure device options. You'll have to type in your credentials to connect to Azure AD. When you do that, you're going to get prompted for this screen here that says configure Azure AD join. So just select the radio button. And then for device operating systems, Windows 10 and later is primarily what you're going to want to do. We do have support for down level operating systems, but we don't even support Windows 7 anymore. Windows 7 is out of support. We've got extended support updates, but there is no support for Windows 7 anymore. If you've got Windows 7 or Windows 8 devices, you got to move. You got to move to Windows 10 or Windows 11. And then once that's been selected, we then configure something called a service connection point. And the service connection point just basically tells your devices what tenant to enroll to. If you want to go into ADSI edit and take a look at what it actually sets in there, you can go and see exactly what it sets. But effectively what this is doing is this is setting up a configuration point so that when the device tries to, when it communicates to the domain, it's going to see, oh, I need to hybrid Azure AD join to this tenant ID. And then that tenant ID is passed to the machine. The machine then does the hybrid Azure AD enrollment. And then that's it. So it's effectively just a checkbox, configure the SCP, and you're good to go. And once you do that, you will then start to see your devices slowly start to roll. I say slowly. And the reason I'm saying slowly is because as soon as you turn this on, you're not going to see just all of your computer objects flow up. Users have to sign into their machines in order for this to work. So you might do this on a Saturday, you could do this over a weekend, but you'll see nothing happen until Monday morning. People start to sign into their machines. And once they sign in, there's a scheduled task on the machine that needs to run. And that scheduled task is going to kick off a process that'll modify the domain computer object, which then will allow the machine to upload into Azure AD. So this is something that's going to take some time. And a lot of it really just depends on your users signing into the device, the scheduled task running, and then so give this, a week or two, or 3 or 4, depending on how your user population is. But it's going to take some time for these device objects to start to show up. Okay, so that's the enrollment into Azure AD. That's just getting the object into Azure AD. That has nothing to do with Intune. For Intune, there's a group policy we have to configure. But before we do that, we need to make sure that our tenant is configured correctly. Now, I'm assuming here that you have your licenses are assigned to your users, and if they're not, do that ahead of time. Make sure that you have A3 licenses assigned, or make sure that at the very least you need to have Intune licenses assigned to your users. Once that is done, within Intune, you'll want to go to the devices node, and under devices, there'll be a subnode in there called enrolled devices. You click on that. That'll then take you to this page here, which says automatic enrollment. Now, this is typically configured in the way that you see here, where it says MDM user scope is all, and MAM user scope is none. Now, sometimes people will, maybe someone went in here and played with Intune, or they came into the console and they did something. And they set MDM user scope to none. What we've seen happen here is someone will set this to none, and then they'll try to do the configuration with group policy or with even Autopilot, and they'll fail. Devices don't enroll because this option here is something that's overlooked and they just don't remember to check it. So make sure to go in here, check this. see that it's set to all. You can have it set to some, but that then requires you to put groups in here for the groups that you want to have their devices enrolled. And you may not come back here and set the groups correctly. The best recommendation here for us, the best practice is to set this to all. And once you validated that, then we need to go into group policy. And there's a policy that needs to be configured here. It's a computer policy. So if you go under Windows Components under MDM, there's a policy in here for the enrollment of the device. And so we'll select the, set that policy to enabled. And then we want to make sure that in the enable automatic MDM enrollment setting that we're leveraging user credentials. And this might be backwards thinking. You might think, oh, I'm going to change this to device. You actually are using the user to do the authentication or to do the enrollment into Intune. And so this must be set to user. So then you might think, okay, well, what's the device credential used for? And the device credential is used for Azure Virtual Desktop scenarios, which, if you're going to use AVD, you'll need that. But for what we're talking about today, to get all of your devices enrolled, user credential is what you want to select. And so I mentioned in here that we have some resources for configuring hybrid Azure AD join. I mentioned earlier that I've got the docs here, so you can go and take a look at those if you want to get a deeper dive in both that as well as how to enroll Windows 10 devices into Intune using group policy. Now, let's talk about new device enrollment, right? So with new devices, we've really got 2/3 ways to 2 to 3 ways that we recommend you enroll. Now, you can enroll, again, I mentioned earlier, you could go through the out-of-box experience and type in your username and password without Autopilot. That's a method. You could go to settings. There's a way through settings, adding your account. You can go that method. We don't recommend those methods for a number of reasons, but mainly they're very manual. And, with schools, we have challenges where we're doing hundreds or thousands of devices every school year. And it's just it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to go and manually type in usernames and passwords to enroll. So the methods that we recommend, really Autopilot is the first method that we would recommend. And the way that this works is that you pre-register the devices in the cloud through your OEM or your reseller. And you tell them, hey, I want to buy 1,000 Lenovo laptops. And I'm buying these laptops. I need you to enroll these Lenovo or reseller. I need you to enroll them into Autopilot for me. So when they're enrolled, they show up in my Intune tenant, and I can target applications and settings to those objects before they actually arrive. And so once those devices arrive, you unbox them. Intune is installing all the apps and settings. And we'll look at that here in a minute. The next option is leveraging Windows Configuration Designer. Now, if you're not familiar with it, Windows Configuration Designer is a tool that allows us to create what we call a provisioning package. And that provisioning package has applications and settings. It can have applications and settings inside of it that allow you to enroll that device into your tenant. And then lastly is a tool called Setup School PCs, which it's like Windows Configuration Designer, but it's education focused, but it has a lot of settings and applications that are already built into it, and it's somewhat rigid. So if you want to have some more flexibility, then you would probably use Windows Configuration Designer. If you're trying to pick between, should I use Configuration Designer, should I use Setup School PCs? You'll get more flexibility with Configuration Designer, but Setup School PCs has a lot of school-specific settings that are already built into it. And so you can take a look at both of those and see which one meets your needs. Now, going back to Autopilot, I sort of mentioned this earlier, but from a visual perspective, what does this all look like? And if we start on the left, you're going to make that purchase with the vendor. You're going to say, hey, buy my devices. I need you to enroll them to Autopilot. So the vendor is going to take the device IDs and upload those into the Windows Autopilot service. And in that service is going to synchronize that data between Autopilot and Intune. And so when you look in your Intune portal, you'll see these devices that your vendor has uploaded. And then you will create an Autopilot profile. And that profile is what allows for the out-of-box experience to be automated. So your end users aren't accepting policy screens. They're not accepting the EULA and all of, they're not getting prompted for all this stuff during the out-of-box experience because your Autopilot profile is taking care of that for you. And so you're creating that in Intune, and that is synchronizing over to the Autopilot service. So the hardware vendor, if we go back to the left, the hardware vendor now is going to ship those devices to either you centrally at the central IT department. You can have a warehouse, you can have some building where everything, all this stuff goes to, or they're shipping the devices directly to your employees, probably not directly to your students, but maybe to your teachers or staff members. And so whoever gets the device, whether it's you as IT or whether it's some end user, someone's going to unbox that device. And when you unbox that device, we're now going to communicate to the Autopilot service. We're going to connect to the internet. We'll go to the Autopilot service and we'll see that there's a profile that's been assigned to us by IT. And we start the Autopilot flow. And that's essentially where we sign into our device with our school email address and password. And once we sign in, Intune then will take over and start deploying applications and settings from Intune. And so in this experience, IT didn't really have to touch the device. They didn't have to re-image the device. You might think, well, we have to re-image devices because HP, Lenovo, Dell, and Microsoft put a bunch of stuff on these things that we don't want. But your vendors actually do have services that do tie into Autopilot. And often they will provide you with a clean installation of Windows. It might not be the most recent installation of Windows. It might not have the latest cumulative updates in it. It may not even have the latest release of Windows. But at the very least, it should have a clean installation of that operating system. And so you can work with your vendors to make sure that they're providing you with clean installations, as opposed to those that have a lot of the bloatware applications that you don't want on those devices. And so from an Autopilot perspective, different scenarios. So when you go into Autopilot, you create your profile, it's going to ask you in the wizard, like, which type of profile do you want? Do you want a user-driven one, or do you want a self-deploying one? And so within user-driven, we have two states. You have Azure AD Join and you have hybrid Azure AD Join. Now you can see in the big bold that I put in that second column, it says not recommended for hybrid Azure AD Join. And the reason for this is because we don't recommend hybrid Azure AD Join from a Autopilot perspective, because it's a very complicated process to set up. You have to have line of sight to your domain controller, which if you're configuring these devices on premises, it's not a big deal. But if you're trying to configure these things over the internet, then you have to have a VPN that is configured that can communicate during the out-of-box experience to the device or to your domain to communicate to that DC. And so there's just a lot more potential to go wrong in this scenario. It also takes a lot longer to configure because we need to wait for hybrid or for Azure AD Connect to synchronize the device objects. So that second column there that says hybrid Azure AD Join for user-driven, we don't really recommend that. The first column, though, and sorry that I'm kind of jumping back and forth here, but the first column for user-driven, this is where we see most customers leverage Autopilot, is the user-driven scenario. And in this state, someone signs into the device, and I'll have a demo of this here in a second. But you'll sign into the device with your email address and your password. And when you sign in, all your applications and settings come down. And this is different from self-deploying, because with self-deploying, there is no sign-in. So when you do self-deploying, this is a scenario primarily for kiosks and shared devices. So you might have I don't know if you guys are going back to laptop carts at all. I know a lot of schools are moving one-to-one. With all the funding that's been given to districts over the last couple of years, most are moving to one-to-one. But you still have the shared scenarios, right? You have labs, you've got kiosks and things like that. And so Autopilot with self-deploying can be used in that scenario. Now, in this scenario, to keep it secure, it does require TPM 2.0 and device attestation is available on that device. Relatively newer devices should meet this requirement, no problem. If you have older devices, like really old devices, like older than like 2016, 2015, you probably won't be able to accomplish this. But relatively new machines should be just fine. We have Autopilot for existing devices. This is primarily a Windows 7 to Windows 10 migration. I wouldn't worry so much about this. It really leverages Configuration Manager. in order to do it. And then lastly, Autopilot for pre-provisioning scenarios. And this is a scenario where your vendor, so you might have a hardware vendor that you work with, and you might provide them an image today. You might create an image in SCCM or MDT, and you say, vendor, put this on all of my devices that I purchase. Well, that method can be moved to Autopilot pre-provisioning. And this is where we can have the vendor essentially unbox the device for us, and then they'll hit the Windows key 5 times. So they'll boot the device, hit the Windows key 5 times, and it comes up with a menu. On that menu, it'll say Autopilot pre-provisioning. They select that, and then it'll start to install all of the applications and settings from Intune. Once that's done, there's a button on their screen that says reseal. They click that, and then the device is sys-prepped, and it's sealed. They box the device up, they ship it to you. You receive that device, unbox it, turn it on, and then you sign in with your credentials, and it's just like the user-driven scenario that I mentioned earlier. So what your hardware vendor is doing essentially for you is they're installing all the applications and settings at the factory, and then your end user is getting that device, and they don't have to wait for any of that stuff. So it's very similar to replicating that old school image the device, create the image, give it to our vendor, and then the vendor puts the image on for us. So pre-provisioning is a replacement for that. Okay, so let's demo some of this and see what it all looks like. So what I'm going to start with here, and I think last week, I'm going to stop presenting this, and then I'm going to share my screen here. Let's share the screen. So I guess I should say last time, when we did the 11SE presentation, let me just start this up here. Should be at UBI. When we did the 11SE presentation, I sort of did this already. So if you remember that, it's more of a recap. But this device is it's just an out-of-the-box Windows 11 machine. There's nothing special about the configuration of it, but it is enrolled into Autopilot, and we'll look at what that looks like in the console in a sec. I just want to get this started first, and then we can go and look at what that looks like in Intune. Actually, let's flip and do that now, because this checking updates piece might actually take a little bit. So let's pull Intune over here. So within Intune, or the Microsoft Endpoint Admin Center, so if you go to endpoint.microsoft.com, and then go to Devices, and then go to Enroll Devices. This will take us to our Windows Autopilot deployment program here at the bottom. And so down here, this is where I can see the devices. And so if I'm working with Lenovo or Dell, HP, Microsoft, they can upload all of these devices for me into my environment, like I mentioned earlier. And this is where you would see all the devices that they have uploaded. And so you'll see the serial number, the manufacturer, the model. There's this group tag thing. Group tag, this is something that you can tell the vendor, hey, I want you to put a group tag on all of my machines. And we can use that tag to group devices. And so I can say that, hey, Lenovo, I'm buying a bunch of 11SE devices. I want you to put SE on that tag. And then based on that tag, I can go into Azure Active Directory. I can make a group. And so this group, got a number here of them here with a group tag that says SE. And so if I go to Azure AD, go into my groups, make a new group called with a dynamic membership rule, I can see in here that I've got a device ID. The syntax, don't worry so much about it, but just focus really on this part right here, this SE piece. This is that group tag value. So I'm telling my vendor, hey, tag all these machines so I can group them, because I need to target stuff to them, right? I need to target things to these machines. So I tell the vendor to put SE on all these devices to this tag. I make this group, and then in Intune I can go and I can create an application, and I can deploy my apps. I go to my Windows applications here. I can go and take an application, and I can target my application I've got this target all devices, but I can change this group to my SE group that I showed earlier. So do something like that. Select my Autopilot SE. So you can create the groups ahead of time once you've told your vendor, hey, put the group tag for SE, and then I'm going to go make my groups. So before you even receive the devices, you can get all this stuff set up and then deploy. Now, I mentioned profiles earlier too. So with deployment profiles, just going back to SE because that's the device we're going to be looking at. In this deployment profile that I've got created, I mentioned earlier user-driven deployments with Azure AD join. This is what we would recommend. So most of your devices will probably be in this type of configuration. And then I've got this various settings that I can set for the out-of-box experience. And effectively, all we're doing is automating UBI. So we don't want our end users to have to accept licensing terms and privacy settings. We don't want them to be able to change account options, because if they change account options, they can use a local account to sign in. We don't want any of that. We also don't want them to be administrators. Now, you might have you might have your teachers as local admins. We don't recommend it. It's not a security best practice to have your regular users as admins on their machines. I get it. They might have to install some apps. They might have to configure something on the OS. But by and large, your users should be standard users. And so this is what we would recommend you set for your Autopilot profile for the majority of your users. For pre-provisioning, I mentioned earlier the white glove or the Autopilot pre-provisioning scenario. This is where you would configure that. So if you wanted your vendor to do the pre-provisioning stuff, to install the applications and settings ahead of time, then you would configure a user-driven profile to pre-provision deployment. You set this to yes. And then we have language and region settings. We have keyboard settings to automatically configure that. And then device name template. And so this is where I name the device. So you put a device name prefix. In this case, I'm using SE-serial. And then the percent serial here, this is going to take the serial number of the machine and append it to that prefix. You can also use %rand. This would be a random number of characters. So you can do a %rand : and then 5, and you get 5 random characters at the end of the device name. And so that's what the profile looks like. And so these profiles, once they've been configured, they then have to be assigned and deployed to something. And so I've got this assigned to my virtual machine based on that group tag value that I had created earlier. So I'm using that group that I made based on the group tag. Now let me flip back over to the VM here because it's ready. So this VM, again, brand new, out of the box. We'll just sign in with a student account. And so what this is doing is it's going to enroll the device in Azure AD, and then it's going to join into Microsoft Intune. And it's going to reboot, and it's also going to display something called our enrollment status page. And the enrollment status page should come up here in a moment, is showing, and that's what this is right here. This page is it's like a gatekeeper. It keeps your users from getting to the desktop until everything has been deployed and configured on the machine that you have set up in Intune. And so right now you can see that it's went through and it's joined to the organization's network. It's registered it into Intune, and now it's preparing for mobile management. And what this is, there's an agent that gets installed from Intune that's being deployed right now. Once that agent gets installed, we then can start to set the device up and apply our security policies, certificates, network applications, all that stuff. And so this could take some time. So going over the internet, so there's a lot of variables at play. So this will take some time to set up. So we're not going to sit and watch this. It'll be like watching paint dry. So we'll let this thing go for a bit. And then what I'm going to flip to now is talking about Configuration Designer. So let's go back into the presentation and we'll talk about that for a minute. get to this slide. Okay. So we talked about Autopilot, and now let's talk about provisioning packages. So provisioning packages, they leverage something called a bulk enrollment token. And a bulk enrollment token is, it's a token that's used to register devices into Azure Active Directory. And this token, like its name suggests, it's bulk, so you can use this on hundreds or thousands of devices if you want. There's really no limit for the number of devices you can use. I've had customers that do this with 60,000 devices over the course of a school year. So I mean, we've got really large customers that leverage these provisioning packages. And the way it works is that you'll use a tool called Windows Configuration Designer, which we'll look at here in a sec. And that tool will create the package for you. And that package, when you create it, you put it on a USB drive. And that USB drive will then get inserted into the target computer that you're trying to enroll. And when we enroll that machine, or we put that USB drive into the machine, that USB drive will immediately start to apply whatever is configured in that package. So it's going to enroll it into Azure AD, and if you have settings or applications in it, it'll install and configure those too. And the reason why you might want to look at using something like this is because it's fast. If you're working in a warehouse and you're trying to get thousands of devices ready for school, Autopilot might be too slow for you because we have to wait for things to come down from the internet. And if it takes you 15, 20 minutes for a device to provision, like you're imaging today, and you know that it takes probably about 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes in most cases. You might have a really big image that could take an hour, take an hour and a half. But most customers I talk to that do imaging today, it's about 20 to 30 minutes for an image to come down. And if that's the case, could we make that faster? Can we reduce that amount of time? And with Autopilot, you can probably reduce it, but you're probably getting back maybe down to 10 to 15 minutes. But could we go faster than that? Well, a provisioning package can make that faster if we can put everything into that package. And so if we're doing these huge, large-scale rollouts, provisioning might actually be better than using Autopilot. But if you're using pre-provision, like I mentioned earlier, with your vendor, and your vendor's doing all that work, then you ultimately don't care if they're doing Autopilot or provisioning. What you care about is when I receive this device, when my students sign in or my users sign in, are all the applications and settings there? And are they able to be productive immediately? Like they're not waiting for things to happen before they can actually use the device. Okay, so let's look at Configuration Designer and what this is. So Configuration Designer, before we actually, so you see the tool, whoop, you actually don't see it on my screen. Let me change this. Share. We'll share this screen. Okay. So Configuration Designer, first you gotta get the tool, right? So let's go to the Microsoft Store. In the store, so in the store, do a search for Windows Configuration. And so Windows Configuration Designer should be the first result on the left. So select that. And then I've already got it installed, so I just can click on open. I've already got it open, so I don't need to do that. But this is where you go to install it. And once it's installed, you'll be prompted with a screen that looks similar to this. You won't have all the projects like I do. I make packages, just probably about 10 packages a week for various demos and things. So I've got a ton of stuff here. But when you get into this, the thing that you're going to want to do is click on this provision desktop devices. And when you provision the devices, you'll have a wizard that pops up. Give your project a name. I'm just going to keep default here, but you can give it a more useful name than that. And it's going to take you through a wizard to create the package. And so this is where we can name our device. And so in Autopilot, I used SE- and then %serial. So I can do that here too. But I can also put my product key in. I can also configure devices for shared use using shared PC. And I can also remove pre-installed software. Don't do this. First of all, it might be confusing to you if you don't know what this thing does. But what this does is it does a reset of the device, and it will. So imagine an UBI, right? We take our provisioning package and we plug the package in, and then it immediately resets. Well, that's going to take probably 30 minutes to get through. But what's it doing when it's resetting? And how is it removing pre-installed software? Well, it's removing there's a provisioning package that your OEM puts on the device. When they ship you a device, when HP ships you a laptop, there's a provisioning package that is in the installation of that image that they put on it. And that package has all the HP stuff in it. It's got all the software you don't want. And so what this does is it says, okay, I'm going to reset the device, but I'm not going to apply that provisioning package. So I'm going to apply this one, the one I'm making, I'm going to apply this one, but I'm not going to apply the OEM provisioning package that they have stored on this device. And so when they set that up, or when you set this up and you go through this process, it's going to take 30 minutes to do that, and it's just going to be, it's going to take a long time to do that. So don't set this. Just request that your OEM provides you a clean installation to begin with, and then you don't even need to do this. This does not remove any Microsoft software, so it does not remove like Xbox and Skype and all those other applications that you probably don't want. There are ways to handle that through Intune, but this don't set this. Network. So network, we got to have a network to join to. What you need to know is that when you're setting up your networks, you're not joining your enterprise wireless network here. You are joining a staging network. So you've got a Chromebook network already today. Unless you're not using Chrome at all, which you're probably one of the rare customers. You're one of the rare education institutions that does not have any Chromebooks in their environment. But you probably have some sort of hidden network or some network that is isolated to registered devices, to maybe Apple, or to Google. You would use that network for this because we need to get out to Microsoft to enroll the device to Azure AD to get the device into Intune. Now in Intune, if you want to create an enterprise wireless profile, you can do that in Intune and have Intune deploy it out. You can't create that enterprise wireless profile in Configuration Designer. Even in the advanced editor, you can't do it. But you can do that through Intune. And if you want to push out certificates, if you need to push out certs for your wireless as well, you can do that through Intune as well. So more complicated configuration to set that up, but it's possible. So in here, we just need to put some sort of wireless network. So just do whatever your SSID is and password. And then for enrollment, this is where we want to do enroll into Azure AD. And this is that bulk enrollment token I was talking about. So you click into this, it'll ask you for credentials. I've already done the credentials today on this machine, so it's just going to cache those credentials. But if I hadn't done that, it'll prompt me for a username and password. I type my credentials in, I now get my token. This token does expire, like it says. It expires on the 29th of August. So once it expires, I won't be able to use this package anymore. I have to make a new one. So just know that these things have 6-month expiration dates on them. Now, you can also create a local admin account. So if you want to create a local admin account, this is the place to do that. And applications. So this is where I can add some simple applications. If you're interested in adding more complicated applications that have like multiple folders and files, you can reach out to us. I've got ways that I kind of handle this. There's nothing public on Microsoft Docs on how to handle this, but I've worked with some very large customers, like the millions of seats in other countries that are trying to solve for low bandwidth scenarios where they just don't have the bandwidth to get out to install things from Intune. And so we've got to come up with really creative ways on how to locally install that content. And so we do it through provisioning packages, but this user interface is pretty simple. It just basically, like if I wanted to just push like Chrome out through here, I could do it. I click on browse. It's gonna ask me, where's the MSI file? But you're going to have applications that don't have just MSIs. They might have an EXE, and there's like a bunch of folders and all sorts of other stuff. And so this user interface doesn't really provide an easy way to handle that. We do have ways to do that, but that's kind of outside the scope of this presentation. Now, certificates. You can add certificates to the packages. These are generally just going to be like your trusted root cert or maybe an intermediary cert. This is not a a unique certificate for a user or a device. This is just, a trusted root cert that you might need. Cancel that. And then once we're done, we can create the package. And we create this package. Package will take you to this folder here, and the file that you need is this. You take this file and you put it onto your USB drive. And once it's on the USB drive, we can plug that into a machine. And so what does that actually look like? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my virtual machine, and let me stop present. I'm going to present my other screen here. One sec. Okay, so I'm on the other virtual machine, and so this virtual machine, it's just another Windows 10 installation. Actually, this is Windows 10, not Windows 11. So this is just Windows 10 stock ISO, nothing special about it. But we're going to apply a provisioning package to it that I've already pre-created. I just went through the wizard just like you saw me go through just now. I went through it earlier and I made a package for this. And so at the first screen of the out-of-box experience, you unbox the device, you're going to put your USB drive into the USB port. Now, I can't do that on Hyper-V. I can't just pop in a USB drive here. So what I have to do is I have to hit the Windows key 5 times. And I mentioned this earlier. If you hit the Windows key 5 times on any brand new Windows 10 or Windows 11 device, you get this menu. Now, I talked about pre-provisioning for Autopilot earlier. That's that second option there. But the first option is install provisioning package. Before I do that, let me just make sure to put the package in here. So I've got the package and I've mounted it into this VM. So I'm going to install it. And so this is a different experience, but it's similar. So I didn't have to type in a credential because that's already taken care of for the bulk enrollment token. So what it's doing is it's applying the token, it's joining to Azure AD, and it's renaming the computer. So the rename is what causes the reboot. So once this reboot's done, it's going to continue to apply the package. And once this finishes, then it'll start to join to Azure AD. And then once the Azure AD join's done, we'll get to the logon screen and we can type in our Azure AD credentials to sign in. And so I mentioned that this is fast. It's way faster than Autopilot because there's the only reason we need internet access is to just get the device enrolled. And so the enrollment piece is fast. But what about my applications and settings? Well, those will come down eventually. But if I have all my apps and settings in the package, then it's going to take some time for those things to install. But I don't have to download those from the internet because they're already local. And so with this package, I could sign into my tenant and just notice that I'm using just my username. I don't have to use my full UPN. I don't have to type in the whole email address because in the package I created a custom setting that allowed me to configure the preferred tenant domain. Oops, let me try it again. So if I go back to the package that I made earlier, this package here, I've got a custom policy that says preferred AAD tenant domain, and I just typed in what the tenant domain is. So, oops, lost that. Let me go back to that. Okay, so by putting that preferred tenant domain in there, that's what pre-filled all this in for me. So I can just type in student and then password. And so now my student account can just sign in and it'll create the profile. This is going to take some time. There's nothing really interesting to watch here. But this will take time for the profile to get created and for Intune to push out whatever I've got configured for this machine. But going back to the other machine. So the other machine, I can basically do the same thing. This already enrolled earlier. This was all done through Autopilot, and this is 11 SE. So when I sign into this machine, it's going to create the profile, and then I should have Intune, already pushing out Chrome and a number of other applications, which is similar to what I showed a couple weeks ago on the 11SE webinar that we did. So we've got 15 minutes left. I'm gonna wrap up here by talking about applications, and well, actually, let's go back to the slides. So I've got a few points I want to make to wrap up the enrollment, and then we'll talk about applications and policies. So let's do this. Okay, that's good. Okay. So how do we choose how do we choose Autopilot versus provisioning packages? And the answer is, the answer is always, it depends, right? Anytime you talk to Microsoft and they ask me, hey, how should I do something? We always tell you it depends. And so you hate us because it's like a wishy-washy answer. But Autopilot, you have scenarios that this works well for. You have one-to-one deployments. If we're working with faculty and staff members, a brand new device, Autopilot works well for that because we're shipping the device directly to them. The device, they can use that device, works fine. If the device is shipped directly to your end user, again, very easy scenario to handle with Autopilot. And if the user is the first user to sign in, then Autopilot works well in that scenario. We're going to talk about first user here in a second, or what we call primary user. I've got a whole slide to talk about some scenarios there. But if the user is going to be the first user to sign in that gets the device, then Autopilot's going to work well in that scenario. Provisioning packages. Provisioning packages work well in both shared and one-to-one scenarios. And they work well in scenarios where you're having devices shipped to a warehouse, and then they're going to be delivered from the warehouse to your school district or to your school campuses. If you are having those devices, if you're in a low bandwidth scenario, then provisioning packages are going to work well because you can put all your content inside of the package if you need to. And then, as I mentioned earlier, large scale deployments, both one-to-one and one-to-many. If speed is essential in that scenario, then you're going to want to use provisioning packages over Autopilot. And I share this screenshot or this picture here. This is from, I don't know, probably 4 years ago. It's been a while, but this is one of our early Intune customers that had this large warehouse that they would provision devices in. This is a 60,000 seat customer. And what you're seeing here is they've got all the laptops set up with provisioning packages, and they unbox everything, they plug them all into power, they pop in the USB drive, and they provision all of those devices. And so when you're in a scenario like this, Autopilot is difficult to manage because it's not only just downloading all the content, but it's also logistically challenging because when you tell your vendor, hey, I want you to put group tags on these 1,000 devices for school ABC, and then I've got school 1, 2, 3, and I need a group tag for 1, 2, 3. When you get thousands of boxes, trying to figure out which group and which device goes to, it's very difficult to do that when you've got so many different group tags and devices and boxes and everything. Just logistically, it becomes very challenging to keep all that stuff straight. So with provisioning, you can reduce that sort of issue. Oh, mute.
I didn't mute myself.
Interesting. All right, so some considerations. So I
can't hear him anymore.
Talked about primary user, and so with primary user, your devices, when you enroll a device into Intune, there's a field in there called primary user. And the primary user of the device actually has some things that they can do that the second, third, and fourth user that comes onto that device can't do. So if you're in a one-to-one scenario, this really isn't a problem. But if you are in a scenario where you have a shared device or you have multiple users that's signing into the device, you need to understand what primary users can do and they can't do. So with Autopilot, with user-driven and pre-provisioning, the first user that signs into that machine is considered the primary user. Now, the primary user can use the company portal to install self-service applications. So they can go to the company portal, they can install Adobe Reader. If you make that available to them, they can install that application. So required applications will install just fine. But available applications that you want users to self-service from a portal, the primary user is the only one that can do that. Now they can also self-service the BitLocker recovery key. So you can go to myaccount.microsoft.com, and if they get locked out of their machine, they're prompted for BitLocker key, they can go ahead and select that. And then any user that signs in after the primary user will not be able to use the company portal to self-service applications or get the BitLocker recovery key. And that's in scenarios where you're using Autopilot user-driven or pre-provisioning scenarios. If the device is enrolled through like the out-of-box experience without Autopilot and someone signs in, that user is also the primary user. So primary users are really important because if you as the IT admin just signs into all these machines just to provision them, and then you give the device to a student or to an end user, they're the second user. And if they're the second user, they won't be able to use the company portal to self-service applications. And that goes back to why I was kind of harping on this point here, where what Autopilot works well for, the third item on that list there, where it says user is the first user to sign in. So if the user you're giving the device to is the first one to sign in, their primary user, they then can use the company portal to self-service application installs. They can get their own BitLocker recovery key. So if you're going to be signing in as the IT admin, well, then they're not going to be the primary user anymore. So you should then start to look at, okay, well, if I'm going to sign in, maybe I should use a provisioning package, because a provisioning package is a bulk enrolled scenario. And in the bulk enrolled scenarios, anyone can use the company portal. And so in that scenario, you're not blocking anyone. So some things to think about in terms of how to handle the primary user. Now, for the no primary user scenarios here, this is really the self-deploying and provisioning package enrollments. Company portal can be used by anyone. BitLocker recovery keys can be pulled by any user. BitLocker recovery keys cannot be seen by any of the users that sign onto that device. In order to get that recovery key, they must call into the help desk, so an admin can go and get the recovery key from the AD or the Intune portal. Okay, so apps and policies. I've got a few minutes here to talk about apps and policies for a bit. So apps and policies. Real quick on this, and it might make sense for us to have a longer session on this because enrollment is really a big topic that honestly, we could have probably actually just spent 2 hours to really go over this, even more depth. Apps and policies probably really deserve their own session. But real quick on just some high level things to think about from an apps and policies perspective. When we look at apps, Intune can manage multiple platforms, right? It can manage Windows, iOS, macOS, and Android. And we can manage the applications for those. Primarily, the applications for iOS and Android are coming from the Google Play Store or from the Apple App Store. macOS applications, you'll upload those applications that you download from various locations. And it's the same thing with Windows. But with Windows, it can be a little confusing because there's actually multiple application types within Windows. And so what I mean by that is if I go and create a new app in here, I've got Microsoft Store apps, I've got line of business apps, and I've got Windows 32 apps. And so what should you be using? Well, store apps kind of going away. Although there are some store apps that you're going to want to deploy. One of those being Company Portal, which you see over here in My Tenant. You can synchronize the store app from the Microsoft Store into Intune and deploy the Company Portal. Minecraft is another one that you might want to deploy. There's also a Win32 app for Minecraft as well, so you can. There's some pros and cons to that, but I don't have time to get into those right now. But then there's this line of business app and this Windows app. And so you might come into this line of business app and you might look at the description here and say, oh, Windows, okay, I can deploy on the size. Cool. Let me do that. Because I've got Chrome Enterprise.msi and I want to deploy that out. You might do this. We don't recommend you actually use this though. And the reason for this is because what we see some customers do is they'll use this because it's easy, but it causes problems with Autopilot. Where Autopilot, if you have a mix of line of business and Win32 apps, Autopilot and Windows can't really control which is installing at what point in time. So you might have a line of business app that installs at the same time a Win32 app installs, but both of those are being installed by something called MSI exec. And so if MSI exec is trying to figure out who's installing what, you could run into a collision, and you run into a problem where Autopilot just doesn't know what to do, and you can run into a failure during deployment. So what we recommend is for any applications that you're deploying, that MSI, EXE, anything you're downloading from any of your vendors, typically it's going to be an MSI or an EXE file, right? And those files and those packages all should be packaged up into a Win32 app. And so the Win32 app that you deploy, you have to package these up into something called an Intune Win file. In the deck, which I'll send over, the deck will have a link to the documentation, or you can just go and look up Intune Win32 apps. The documentation there will tell you how to build these packages. But this is where you'll upload your package file. I've got one of these already. I'm just going to look at one that's already been made. Let's look at Acrobat Reader. So for Acrobat, so the Acrobat installer is actually an EXE, but then I also needed to know what the silent switch is. If you've been doing device management for any period of time, you know how fun it is to find all the different switches that all the different vendors use. And so this, they use /s all for their switch. But I've got
Richard.
Yes.
Sorry, are you on the resource slide? Looks like everyone's just. I don't know if you're on a different slide, but we can't see what's happening.
Oh, my bad. I've been talking for a while. Yeah, no, I got out of the deck and I wanted to share the.
Oh, okay.
That's okay. Thanks for letting
me
know.
All right.
Sorry, guys. So let me back up here for a minute so I can show you what I was talking about earlier. So when it comes to application deployment, again, I mentioned all the different platforms, but within Windows, we've got those multiple application types. And so when you go and create a new Windows app, you have store apps, you've got Microsoft 365 apps and Edge. Don't worry about those for now. But really the store apps and then line of business and Win32 apps. These are the primary app types that you're going to be dealing with for Windows. Store apps, as I mentioned earlier, company portal app is one that you're going to want to deploy. But the line of business applications, you might come into here and think, you might come and look at this and find that, oh, I can deploy Windows apps, and hey, I've got an MSI file. I mentioned earlier chrome.exe or chrome.msi. You can deploy the enterprise installer Chrome by doing this. And it's super easy to do because you just upload the MSI and you're done. But Autopilot has problems with this, as I was mentioning earlier. If you're mixing line of business and Win32 apps together, you could run into that collision that I was talking about. And so we don't want to run into that problem. So our recommendation is that for any application that you're uploading into Intune, you want to wrap them as Win32 apps. And so this is the file format that we recommend, because Autopilot and Intune, they'll handle this process. Whereas the line of business and Win32, if you mix those together, you can run into an indeterminate state, and you can run into some problems with that. Now, for Win32 apps, when we look at these, I'm just going to look at an example one that I've got here for Adobe Reader. For Adobe Reader, when you upload these applications, you need to then configure the installation commands, just like you do in SCCM today or some other third-party product. Like, how do I install these things silently? You got to go find the switch, right? You got to get the executable, find the switch, or the MSI, find the switches, and then whatever the uninstall command might be, put that in there as well. And then how restarts are handled by your app, you got to also control those as well. Requirements, pretty simple to handle these, but the one that catches most people is detection rules. How do I correctly define my detection methods? Because with these applications, what they're doing is we deploy it to the device, but we need to know, hey, is this application already there? If the application's already there, then we don't want to try to install it. So we're going to run this detection rule to check, see program files, Adobe Reader, does the application exist? And if it does, don't download. Don't do that. So you'll need to go and figure out when you're deploying your apps what the detection method is that you want to use. And so once you're done with that, then you'll go and review and save and save the application and deploy it. So this is a lot more work. The MSI is pretty easy. You just upload it, you're done. You don't have to do detection method, you don't have to do requirements, you don't have to do program, like you don't do any of this stuff. But it's a really dumb way of installing. And I say dumb not because it's like stupid. It's just it's not smart from a detection method requirement point of view where we can't just pre-detect. Like we're just going to try to install. If you push it out, we'll just try to install. So we download and we attempt to do that installation. So Win32 apps, that's where you should be putting most of your focus for application deployment on the Windows side of things. And with that, I know we're over time by a minute, and I know I've had some colleagues of mine answering questions. If there's anything, we still have quite a few people here on here. So all of the Florida questions, I know I didn't talk about policies, and I think maybe James or Melanie, maybe we should set up another session just to go over policy management, because that's probably a topic that really deserves probably its own hour to just really go over like group policy and Intune policy and the differences there, because usually that's where most people have a lot of questions.
Yeah, we did have feedback to do a session on that, so that would be amazing. You and I can kind of coordinate something like that here
Awesome.
soon. So thank you so much. I just want to give a shout out to Patty and Garrett. Thank you guys so much for helping support, answer questions in the chat. Richard, this session was amazing. I know we're over in time, and I don't know if it's possible to answer maybe like 1 or 2 questions. If anyone wants to get on the mic and raise your hand, let's see if we can squeeze in a couple more minutes. But thank you everyone for attending. This is technically our last session for technical training so far scheduled, but we're looking forward to getting more on the books. So if you have any questions or you need support, I put my email in the chat multiple times. Just feel free to reach out to me and I can help coordinate. But thank you again. So if anyone has a question or if you want to grab one from the chat, Richard, whatever works.
Yeah, I'm just kind of scrolling through here. I think Garrett and Patty pretty much answered most of what I'm seeing, so I don't see anything in here.
It's a question on the bulk enrollment token for provisioning packages and the expiration date of 6 months. Could you talk about a little bit why we put a expiration date on that token?
Yeah, so imagine if that token got out, right? So if you think about a scenario where USB drives get lost, someone drops it, they leave it on a table somewhere, and someone grabs it. Now they can enroll devices into your tenant that maybe you didn't really expect. Is that really likely to happen? Like, is someone going to take that USB drive and enroll, their personal computer with that? Is that going to be a big deal? Maybe, maybe not. But it's a scenario where we just want to make sure that that these tokens they allow someone to do an administrative action within your tenant, because you're typing in an administrative credential or a credential that has rights to allow for enrollment of a bunch of devices. So as an IT admin, yeah, it stinks that I have to regenerate that token every 6 months and I have to manage expiration dates on these things. But again, it just goes back to security, and we just don't want those tokens to get out and just someone to enroll a bunch of devices that you didn't really intend for them to be able to do. I see a hand is up. It's Michael.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I really, really do appreciate it.
Awesome.
During the presentation, you showed us the deployment package creation, and there was a section that had network, and you had to tie it to Wi-Fi.
Yep.
What about desktops that don't have Wi-Fi? And in our lab environment, we just have Dell Optiplex computers.
Yep. Yeah, so just do that.
Okay. I was just making sure I wasn't going to blow up anything.
Yeah, so and that's actually what I do for the demo that I showed with the virtual machine. I turn off the network, so there's no Wi-Fi. Let's see, anyone else? All right, so Scott's asking a question. We'd like to have all the apps installed prior to handing over a laptop face-to-face. How can we do that on-prem without messing up primary user? So you could do pre-provisioning. Like, so what I showed you on that virtual machine where I hit the Windows key 5 times, and I could have hit pre-provision, and I could have had my Autopilot profile configured to allow for pre-provisioning. And then all the applications and settings would have been installed, and then I could have reseal it afterwards, and then just have the user sign in, and then they would be the primary user. So that's one option. The other option is you could do a provisioning package like I did, and then with that package, I might actually have it. Let me see if the machine, the machine's ready. Give me one sec. Yes, let me pull this over here. So Scott, on this machine, this is the one that I installed that provisioning package on. And so, well, there's some weird logon error. It's very strange. I've actually never seen that one happen. Try this one more time. I guess the demo gods are failing me right now. But what normally happens is that with a provisioning package, I would be able to sign in to the device, run company portal, and then I would see in here my applications that are available to me. I might just need to reboot this thing. I don't know what. It's running low on resources earlier this morning on this Hyper-V host, so there could be something going on there. But when you look at the device, hang on, I need to get this banner out of the way. Oh, come on, banner, go. Let me see here, hang on a sec. Okay. Because when you look at the device that was just provisioned from a provisioning package, we should see, I think it's this one here. We'll see here that the primary user is none. So again, if there's no primary user on a device, then they can use the company portal, but they can't get their BitLocker key. And that's the difference. So if they can use the company portal self-service, and all that stuff's great. But if you need them to also get their BitLocker key, then you're probably not going to want to use a provisioning package. You'll probably want to do something like Autopilot pre-provisioning, like I mentioned earlier, because that allows them to sign in through the Autopilot workflow that I showed earlier on that Windows 11 device, and they will then show up as the primary user. Just like on, I think it should be this device here. This was the VM that I enrolled, and so see how it's the primary user is student, and it was enrolled by student. Now, primary user is also interesting because I can change this. Well, that's not how you do it though. I can go into properties, and I can change who the primary user is. So if you have a device where maybe my IT department went through and they enrolled a bunch of devices, and the primary user is my IT logon account, and I want to change that to a different user, you can come in here and change it. Now, this obviously is very manual, but you could also use like PowerShell, Microsoft Graph. If you want to automate some of this stuff, you could change the primary user through automated methods as well. Yeah, looks like I just answered Sherry's question right there. Cool. All right, last call for questions, then we'll wrap up. Nope. All right, well, thanks a lot for joining, everyone. I know the recording will be available. I need to get the slides for this. Actually, even the 11 SE session, I need to get those over to you, James, so you guys can upload those as well. Outside of that, thanks everyone for showing up. Take care.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for tuning in. All right.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Bye.